I read the economic survey a little late, but nonetheless, here are my 2 bits about it. The economic survey, of course, wants to paint a really rosy picture, but it ends up exposing the fault lines that exist in India's economy and the world of finance. Let's begin with the growth rate projections. The economic survey says that in fiscal year 27, which is next financial year, India's GDP growth rate is likely to be 6.8 to 7.2%. Mind you, this is going to be lower than the estimated growth rate of this financial year. The potential growth rate for India has been talked about at 7%. That's point number one. Point number two, the survey highlights the geopolitical risks that exist. It talks about the external environment and says India needs to be cautious. The survey finally admits that the rupee has been falling, but of course blames it on every factor other than domestic factors. It talks about an external environment which is not suitable. It admits that the drying up of the foreign capital inflows poses a very serious threat to the rupee. It also talks about the fact that net surplus from the services sector and the remittances will not be able to offset India's huge trade deficit. So acknowledging here that trade continues to be a big problem with no trade deal in sight. Again, it talks about India's corporates. It actually tells them that you should invest more, you should create more jobs, and also puts out a number that Indian firms outbound FDI, the amount of money that Indian firms are investing overseas, went up from $14 billion to $25 billion. It talks about manufacturing, puts the number at 12.8% of the GDP. Please remember the target was 25%. We'll talk about that in just a bit. But manufacturing is still contributing only 12.8% of the GDP. It talks about a major economic risk, which is AI valuations overseas and everywhere else, and says this could result in a 2008-like economic crisis. It talks about India's class 8 students dropping out and the need to retain them in schools. Again, something that we'll just speak about in a bit. It talks about maize, pulses, cereals, and their average yield being lower than global averages. It talks about traffic and expensive houses being a huge impediment to development. And of course, it talks about a policy reshape as far as the gig workers are concerned. But let's begin with growth. What exactly are we celebrating? I've heard everybody celebrate the growth momentum. What are we celebrating? A sub 7% growth rate or a 7% growth rate? The reality is that India will need to grow at 8.2% every year for the next 21 years if we want to be Viksit Bharat by 2047. That's a reality you can't look away from. That's point number one. Point number two, there is a problem with numbers. If fiscal year 26 real GDP growth is expected to be at 7.4%, how is nominal GDP growth only at 8%? Who explains the difference of just 0.6% there? Also, rupee has depreciated by over 6.5% in the same period. And if nominal GDP growth is at 8%, dollar GDP growth for India is only 1.5%. So how are we talking about the 4 trillion, 5 trillion, $6 trillion economy? Because these numbers matter when we speak about these things. Finally, somebody is admitting that rupee is a problem. But there is no explanation that why is rupee Asia's worst performing currency? Why is the rupee falling against a dollar, which itself is falling? Other currencies have strengthened. And why is the rupee falling against other major currencies as well? Against a pound, against a Swiss franc, against a Singapore dollar, against an Australian dollar, and a whole host of other currencies. The rupee's relentless fall and the pressure on the rupee is absolutely not being explained by anybody in the government. It's all being blamed on foreign portfolio investors pulling out money. That takes me to my third question. Why are FPIs pulling out money out of India? If India has the huge growth momentum that we talk about, how is it that net FDI has turned negative? So the amount of FDI that comes in versus the amount of FDI that goes out has turned negative for the last 4 months. How are companies not investing in an economy which is growing at 8%? It's absolutely, nothing explains that. Fourth, and a very important point there, Indian corporates are also not investing here. The outbound FDI from Indian corporates grew from $14 billion to $24 billion. So they're not investing here, but they're investing overseas, just like some other foreign capital is leaving India's shore and going elsewhere. It then, of course, talks very categorically about manufacturing. It says manufacturing is at 12.8%. Please understand, Manufacturing was at levels of 16% under the UPA government. The target was that manufacturing will make up 25% of the GDP. It is still languishing at 12.8%. So this brings me to my fifth question. What happened to Make in India? What happened to production-linked schemes? Why have they all failed? Why have they all not delivered? I mean, just 2 budgets back, there were 3 or 4 employment-linked incentive schemes that were announced to create 2 crore jobs. How many jobs have been created? One of those schemes was the internship scheme, which was supposed to give internship to 1 crore young people. Only 10,000 people have got internship in the last 18 months. What explains that colossal failure of the scheme, which was copied, of course, from our manifesto? Then, of course, the reality is that a lot of data points out, and it categorically says that the corporate tax as a part of the total tax kitty has gone down. The largest tax collection is happening from the GST, which even the poor pay, followed very closely by the income tax. All the incentives, all the reforms will happen for the corporate sector. It's the Aam Aadmi, it's the common man, the poor, who's actually ended up paying more tax than corporate tax collection. Then, of course, very important, the retention of students beyond class 8th. This is a reality that the government has to wake up to. 90,000 government schools have been shut down. Education budget as a percentage of the total expenditure has gone down consistently in the last 11 years. What is your plan on education? Whether it's higher education or elementary education. Then, of course, the global averages, maize, pulses, cereals, falling short of global averages. What's your plan to make agriculture more remunerative? I think one will keep an eye on that as far as the union budget is concerned. And last but not the least, this survey talks about traffic, snarling traffic and very expensive houses being a impediment to development. What is the government doing about making our cities more livable? I mean, look at the kind of roads, look at the kind of ditches that people are falling into and drowning. You talk about air pollution. Does the government even care? So the reality is, while trying to paint a very rosy picture, the survey has exposed the deep fault lines that exist in the Indian economy. And one of the deepest fault lines is the growth. GDP growth of 6.8 to 7.2% is nothing to celebrate. Numbers are not adding up as far as nominal and real GDP growth rate is concerned. IMF has already raised concerns on our data. And I think one will keep a very, very close eye on the budget. But as of now, Rupee is a problem, net FDI is a problem, FPI outflows is a problem, external trade sector is a problem, no job creation is a problem, agriculture not being remunerative is a problem, the number of schemes launched to make employment-linked incentives not taken off. So what is really happening and who's responsible? Jumlas are not going to fix the economy. Real intent and good policies will. One doesn't see any of that happen.